I'll remember Rachel's name. I have no clue what your name is.
Oh, yeah. My name is Matt, or like Matthew.
Oh, okay, Matthew. All right, we've got Matthew here. This is from Val and you. I'm Randall. You're Matthew. Good to meet you. We're so honored to be. And when we're talking about transformational leadership, you guys are already doing it. I mean, you are the leaders. You're leading in places of concern around the world. Our Timothy fellows, the reason they were selected was because they're already leaders. They're already doing this, leading for justice. But if there's ever been a time in my life when we needed more Micah 6:8 believers, it's today. You know, what does the Lord require of us but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God? And but we also, our organization is named after William Wilberforce. He was a member of Parliament, and when he had a transformation in his own life, he became burdened for the slaves in England, and he spent all of his life as a member of Parliament from the time he was about 24 years old, the rest of his life fighting for freedom for the slaves in England. And 3 days before he died, finally his dream became a reality. We'll find out that he wasn't by himself. Hannah More, many others were with him from various vocations. He was the one who helped change laws. Hannah More, the writer, helped change hearts and change the narrative. And so we'll see how even religious freedom in the United States, it was a pastor, John Leland, not a member of the Continental Congress, he was a pastor, a Virginia Baptist pastor, where he got riled up the Virginia Baptists. And in America, if you take a test of who's responsible for religious freedom, they'll probably say James Madison. And when we get to heaven, if we ask James Madison who's responsible for religious freedom, I think he'll say John Leland and the Virginia Baptists. And so God will use you as an attorney, as a pastor, as a human rights worker, as a layperson, use our churches. And so the strategy for getting rid of slavery was top down and bottom up. You had to change the laws. If there are unjust laws, then injustice will continue. You've got to change the laws. But you've also got to change the hearts. And so you've got to have the grassroots network. Warren and I, and Timothy, we've been involved in the BWA for a lot of years. And it was through the BWA that God opened my eyes to see injustice even in our own country and also around the world. And so we needed that grassroots network around the world. Well, there are probably 48 million Baptists around the world. We're in 128 different countries, so we already had the grassroots network. You're already there. You're already all over the world. And so we entered into a legal relationship. 21 Wilberforce entered into a legal relationship with the BWA a couple of years ago. We're still independent. We still have our own 501c3. We still have our own board. But we're very connected with the Baptist World Alliance because we want to hear stories from you, not from what we read about, but we want stories from the field, from the ground up about injustice. And also, we want you to introduce us to those who are being effective in addressing these issues. Who are the partners? We'll see again, we're reminded that we can't do this by ourselves. It has to be a collaboration. One of the things that we've tried to do is to train leaders, and not just train leaders so that they can own their own companies, but we want to train justice leaders, leaders who will make a difference, leaders who will pay the price to stand oftentimes under great criticism and maybe even persecution to right those things that are wrong. And so rather than just trying to, our offices are in D.C., we do work with Congress, we work with the administration, we work with the State Department. I think we give a scorecard where we give every member of Congress an A to an F on their involvement in justice issues, and religious freedom, international religious freedom issues. And so we've got a voice there. But God just blessed us with an opportunity to speak to presidents and vice presidents and secretaries of state and members of Congress, and we've tried to be as honest and as sincere as we can be in being a voice for our international religious freedom. But at the same time, what we're trying to do is to make sure that this is happening. These freedoms are available in all of the world. So what will it take in Myanmar? What will it take now in Ukraine or Afghanistan? But also, Sudan and so many places, North Korea, so many places around the world. And so this is a conference to help us to train trainers. When we were invited to go to Ethiopia by Gatana, and Gatana's a rock star in Ethiopia. I don't know how many pastors he's helped to train and lead, but literally hundreds, maybe thousands. And so they came and we shared material with them. This is not new material to you, but to many of them it is new material. It is new concepts. And we don't want to talk at a 3,000-foot level. We want something practical so that we can give them some tools to make a difference in their community, make a difference in their country. We can't bring religious freedom. What's going on in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, in the middle belt of Nigeria, is horrendous right now. And we've been there. We've paid a lot of money for security to go to places where even their military have not gone, and unfortunately. But we want to give them some tools that they can use to bring about religious freedom for themselves in Nigeria or in these other countries of concern. Let me see if I can navigate this. The conference overview is that there are three aspects, and you'll see your workbook will have these slides in them. We don't have time to go there. Usually this is a 2-day course. But we're just going to touch some highlights, and maybe throughout the week we'll have opportunities to discuss this some more. And this is a living document. We want you to help us to know some resources that you're using. What European Baptists are doing in leadership development is an incredible program. Andre's been through it himself, and Tony's been a big part of that. So there are other resources out there, but just a tool that you can use. It's already been translated. The book, the textbook, has been translated into Farsi. The workbook has been. We've done some videos in Farsi. And Iran Alive is a ministry that broadcasts to 6 million Iranians choose Iran Alive as their number one network. So 20 million will view their programming, 7/24. 20 million will view their programming every week. And we believe that right now the church is growing faster in Iran than maybe any place in the world. And the battle there is not a battle between Christianity and Islam. 80% of the people living in Iran were born in the last 30 years, and so they were born after the revolution. They're sick of oppressive Islam. And so the battle is really between secularism and Christianity. And so if there is regime change, we want to have leaders that are ready to go, who will help them to come up with a constitution that will guarantee religious freedom and these other privileges. And so they're using this material. They've translated it. And we, again, this is simple material. You can read this book. The book, one of the things, it came from Gatana and others. They said, we need something. When we leave the conference, we need some tools that we can continue to study. So a lot of what we won't talk about are things that you'll find in the book or in the workbook. I've got several other books here that have been key books for me, and be glad to show you some of those. If you want additional copies of the Speak Freedom book, I think they're $6, or with an autograph, they're $5. No, actually, you can just take some. And if God prompts you to write $1 million check to Wilberforce, we will cash it. So now just feel free to take them and use them. And again, if you can help us to get them translated into other languages, then we'll be more than happy to work with you on that. The three principles, if we're going to make a difference, in social justice issues, three things that got to be important. One is we've got to lead with passion. The people that we study, when you read about Martin Luther King Jr. from Warren, he was passionate. Obviously, he gave his life for the cause. We're not going to make change unless we're passionate. I think we are only really at our most passionate self when we're right in the center of God's will. In Philippians 3:12, Paul said, the things that Christ has laid hold for him, this is what he wants for himself. I want to lay hold of those things for which Christ has already laid hold of for me. So we want you to know what your kingdom assignment is. And we'll discuss some ways where you can discern that. You know, how do you know what your kingdom assignment is? So we can be right in the center of God's will. And so you may make a living doing something like oil and gas, legal work, but how can you work towards your passion, whether it's religious freedom or whatever is the social justice issue that God's given you. So you've got to have passion. But there are a lot of people who have passions that aren't effective. If we're passionate about something, we need to be good. We need to be competent. And so leading with excellence. So you got to lead with passion, but you got to lead with excellence. Again, we'll look at Martin Luther King Jr. and see he gave his whole life to study. I mean, you see where he studied and what he studied. He wasn't out there just on, speaking off the cuff. I mean, he had studied world religions. He had studied world systems. He knew what he believed, and he knew why he believed what he believed. William Wilberforce was exceptional and continuing to stay trained. And they went to find out for themselves what slavery was all about. Not the narrative. The narrative was, they're better off. They've been transferred from Africa to the United States. They're given jobs, and on the ships they're singing and dancing and having food. When the reality was they were just packed like wood in the belly of ships, stuffed in there with men, women, children, and many thrown overboard just like cargo. And so they went to find out what is the reality. So leading with excellence, what we've done with this, we've looked for what are the best practices, whether it's religious or non-religious, whether it's nonprofit, corporate, what are the best practices? And the group that we found that have, I think, the most useful tools is Kuznets and Posner, who have 5 best practices. And that's why we'll talk about these. You'll see them in this book. What are the 5 best practices? If we're going to be excellent, then we need to model the way. We need to know how to share an inspired vision. Craig, I was surprised at how many pastors didn't really know how to do a vision. And so when churches would come to us and say, we need a pastor, obviously they want someone who loves the Lord, they want someone who preaches God's word, but they want a leader. And so I wish every church had leaders, but so many didn't have people who knew how to inspire a shared vision, not a vision that was in their back pocket, but a shared vision with the people that are there. So model a shared vision. How do you challenge the process? Right now, after COVID, this is a tremendous opportunity. Of course, it's not after. I mean, we're still wearing masks. It's still... But it's given us an opportunity to start over in so many areas. We need to find out how to check, how to keep score. As a pastor all my life, we kept score. How many you have in church? How many you have in Sunday school? How many baptisms? And how big is your budget? Well, that's not really the biblical method for keeping score. How many leaders are we training? How many disciple makers are making disciples? And what is the footprint of their... So this is a great time for us to really observe and interpret what our observations are. What are we learning? And how can we be more effective? So if you're going to make a difference, you've got to be passionate. But you also need to be good. You've got to be competent. And so there are competences that we can learn. But a third thing is you've got to be strategic. You can be passionate, you can be competent, but if you don't change the system, then injustice will persist. And so how do you change the system? And so part of changing this changes the laws. I've never been more frustrated in my life than our government in the U.S. and the lack of courage, in both parties and people, standing up for truth and justice. And it seems like it's just a re-election or, But you've got to work with Congress. You have to hold them accountable. You have people who run for office that are competent people, but not just that. In the agencies and the state level, and the city level, and all the way up and down. So how do you change the laws? But the second thing is, how do you change the narrative? Just as the British were deceived by the narrative on slavery 200 years ago, how easy it is for us just to buy into the narrative that allows status quo to stay in place. And so what is the truth? What is justice? And how do we fight for it? How do we change? That's why I think having writers and musicians, music is one of the best ways. As a pastor, I always said, nobody goes home humming the sermon, but they're going to be singing those songs that they sang on Sunday morning all week. And so how can we change, hymners, all of these people who are contributing to changing the process? Well, that's what we try to do in the conference and in the book. We'd be glad to train leaders who will go to your own countries and teach this material and adapt it to the things that you're already doing. Here, these are some examples. That's Wilberforce over there, and Mother Teresa, and Martin Luther King Jr., and Corrie ten Boom. Look how different they are. A nun challenged the whole world, a little old nun. And just because she would love a baby at a time, or Corrie ten Boom, just the courage, and even after all of her courage in the war and working with the persecuted, and she continued to challenge us with her boldness and her prayers. So these are just examples of the diversity of those who are leaders. The goal is to provide tools that will assist us to pursue a journey that will offer freedom to those shackled to ineffective or oppressive systems that imperil the vulnerable. We want to pour our lives into people who make a difference. You're not going to get credit for this. You don't get academic credit for this, even though actually Dallas Baptist University does give academic credit for those. Like in Ethiopia, they've got all these certificates. And in China, many of the house church pastors in China that we trained 1,800 house church pastors and lawyers in China, and would give them this certificate from DBU and from 21 Wilberforce, and they'd fall to their knees and just hold it to their chest. I mean, it didn't mean a thing academically, but they treasured it as just an opportunity for them. So we'll partner with other schools as well. Well, that's our goal. So how do we lead with passion? Passion begins with transformation. It has to be something that God does in our heart. And that's why we look at the example of William Wilberforce, where when he was elected to Parliament, he was relatively a wealthy person. He was a very young person. He was a very gifted person. He wasn't full grown. He's about this tall, and a great singer, great voice. And he was a member of 5 social clubs in London. And so he was the life of the party. Pitt was the prime minister. He also was extremely young and one of the close friends of Wilberforce. And they had everything that they wanted. I mean, he had one of the most important seats in Parliament when he was 22 or 21 years old. Wealth, member of all of these institutions. But his heart was empty. It wasn't enough. It didn't fill that vacuum that God had created in his heart. And through a friend who was one of the most gifted academics in England and others, God began to satisfy. Even as a child, when he lived with his aunt and uncle, who were Methodists of all things, and Methodists were heretics back during that time. And when Wilberforce's mother found out he was living with his aunt and uncle who were Methodists, she brought him home. Didn't want him to be influenced by Whitefield and others. But all these people, God's working his life. And so through study of Scripture, he had what he called the great change, what I would just call he's born again. this experience where he just gave his life to Christ. And when he gave his life to Christ, he saw slaves as people, created in the image and likeness of God. And it was not right what was happening to them. And he had two purposes in life, two kingdom assignments: the abolition of slavery and to restore decency, good manners among the people of England, which, that's maybe somebody in America, will be called to do that. And he gave his life for that. So there had to be a change in his heart. So if we're not right by Christ, if we're not right with Christ, if Jesus is not actively working in our life, the Holy Spirit is not working in us to sanctify us, then we're operating in our own strengths. And we can only do what we can do. If God's working in us and through us, then God can do things that will bring him glory. And so that's why passion must be preceded by a change. The power of purpose in Jeremiah 29, we've used that. It was a promise to Israel, but also I think there's so much of it that really relates to who we are. Becoming an emergent leader is not the result of a burning desire for personal greatness. If you're going through this so that you can be adored by the masses and a household name, then this is not the conference for you. Jack and Timothy, one of our presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention, several presidents back, was flying out of China, and he made this statement. He said, there are probably 1 billion people in China who don't even know who I am. And I thought, there are 15 million Southern Baptists who don't know who you are. I mean, we can be so full of ourselves. We can think that we are a force that's great. Well, that's not what this is about. You probably come near being a martyr than you'll come near being famous. But becoming an emergent leader is not the result of a burning desire for personal greatness. It's a recognition that God has a plan for your life. And worldly accomplishments will never fill the hunger of your soul for the purpose for which you have been created. And that's what we saw in the life of Wilberforce and others. Nehemiah knew what assignment God gave him, and he was faithful to that assignment. A God-given burden for justice must precede meaningful change. Emergent leaders face significant opposition. This is a life of criticism, a life of misunderstanding. So maybe you will choose not to come back after lunch. Who wants this? A leader must understand the problem before he or she can recommend a solution. It's got to be a work of the heart. Paul's passion was for his brethren to come to know the Lord, to the point where he said, I would give it up. I'd give up my place, for them to know God's grace. Just corrupt systems are torn down by passionate leaders who hate evil and love goodness, that value the lives of all and champion the cause of the voiceless. That's what we're looking for as we train emergent leaders. I mentioned Philippians 3:12. How do we clarify our calling? How do we know what our kingdom assignment is? A part of finding out what our kingdom assignment is what is that thing that keeps you awake at night? When you're listening to world events, what tugs at your heart more than anything else? For Wilberforce, he didn't champion every evil. He championed slavery because that was what the burden God gave him. And so, it may be pro-life, it may be ministry to women, or it may be human trafficking, it may be religious freedom. What hunger? Our son's passion is hunger, and he's committed his whole life to making sure that hungry children have food to eat, and God's given him a national platform and many times even a global platform. So just really identifying what that kingdom assignment is. Well, I want, Lacey, would you come here, please? I want you to meet Lacey, and I want you to hear how she continues to discover her passion. Just giving you a little bit of background. I mean, here is a young woman who's an attorney in Brazil, so that her dad would hope she'd grow up and be a judge, and then she ends up in Jordan. She ends up in Lebanon, and she ends up in Thailand. Well, as a child, what were your goals or your dreams in life? What did you want to be as a 12-year-old?
I think my dream when I was a child was to be a doctor, but I grew up in a Baptist church and I always prayed for missionaries. So I remember I memorized the names when they give us the names in the church. And before eat lunch, my father asked me, "Can you pray for lunch?" And I start to pray for all the missionaries before lunch. Then they stopped me to come to pray for lunch, but just all the time. But then, after I finished law, I was planning to work for the government or be a judge or something like that. But God just broke my heart, and I started to pray more. I was feeling a kind of depression, not so happy. And then I decided to do YWAM. It was in 2012. And I think it was great because, as you told, God give us a passion, and it was a time that God brought me close to Him. Because I believe that it's really like that. God is more interested in a relationship than the work that we do. So it was a time to have a relationship, to be close to God, to just put my heart and say, "God, what do you want for my life? This is my profession. This is my life. What I can do with everything that I am for bringing glory to you and not just for myself."
So how did your dad feel about that? I mean, you finished law school, and now he's ready for you to go make money, right?
Yes. So before I told him, it's only 6 months. And he told, okay. So I took all the money that I saved, workers, interning in Brazil. And then 6 months there. And all the time when I prayed in YWAM, and YWAM it's wonderful because they encourage us to pray at least 1 hour every day and have your Bible with you and try to seek the will of God for our life. So I grew up in a church, but this was not a practice that I had when I was a youth. I just pray sometimes 10 minutes before to sleep and things like that. Try to be honest. But in YWAM, they told at least 1 hour, try to pray, try to have this quiet time, and it was wonderful. So all the time that I went to pray, like, God, what do you want for my life? God spoke in Isaiah 61. Then after 6 months in YWAM, I come back home. And
so what was Isaiah 61? What was that?
It says that the Spirit, I know in Portuguese, I'll try to translate. The Spirit of the Lord is upon us to make the people that are captive free and help the people that suffer injustice. It's about a prophecy about Jesus. Yeah. So then I went back home and I told I will not go back to YWAM never again because it was really, really hard. But I was not feeling in peace. And one day I was in home and I prayed like 2 hours, cry a lot and say, God, please tell me what you want for me because I don't know what to do. And I told God, I will open my Bible, but please, I'm not opening Isaiah 61 because I know I know I read that. And then I opened it was in Luke 4:18, I think, when Jesus repeats. And God repeats what is in Isaiah 61. I didn't know really that it was the same thing in the New Testament. It was, wow, God, you put together.
You understand what she didn't want God to lead you to Isaiah 61:1. So he leads you to the New Testament. You open that was Luke 4:18. By the way, Luke 4:18 was the sermon I preached when I announced the First Baptist Midland where I was pastor that we were starting this new ministry. So that's, if we want to be where Jesus is working, right? So he tells us, this is where I'm going to work. Bring the gospel to the poor, and the release of the captive, a recovery of sight to the blind, and set free those who are oppressed. So that's, if we want to be where Jesus is working, he told us, this is where I'm going to be.
So yes, and with this word I came to my father. And I told, God spoke with me, I need to go back to IOM. And my father, are you crazy? Like, we just rescued from that. It was his perception, because my family went to my graduation in IOM in Brazil. And in IOM, I was sharing a room, washing my clothes with my hands. It was a little bit hard. And my father, why do you go back there? Like, your friends, they are making money. And I told him, no, God spoke with me. And he told me, if God spoke with you, you can go, but it's your decision. Just go and okay. So in Brazil, it's not like America. We usually stay in home until we get married, or we move to get a new job. So I left my home to be a missionary. And it was, in the beginning, very, very hard. But God is faithful. I have some pictures.
Yeah, let's see if we can get those.
But what happened after that? I come back home. I went to Chile with YWAM, and God told me, now I'm gonna use your profession. You gave me your time for 1 year. Now I will go choose you as a lawyer. And God put this in my heart, and I just come back home, and I was, okay, what do I do now? After 1 year in YWAM, I am a lawyer read. So a missionary organization from another state just moved 15 minutes from my home. And they told me, oh, we really need help. We are going to receive some refugees from Syria in Brazil. And we need someone that has experience in law, but also someone that can bring you comfort and pray for them and have faith. So this was when God encouraged me to join this organization. And I could see how God was preparing me with spiritual gifts, like pray, faith. I was really growing up in faith. And after that, I could help the refugees with the documents in Brazil. Because it was not only about help with documents, and Andrea knows this very well. It's have faith, because Brazil is not so easy. Things don't work so easy. So we need to go back and, no, this is wrong, this is what the law says, and try to. And they thought, are you bring terrorists to Brazil? No, they are. First, most of them are Christians, and they just lost their homes because the invasion of the Islamic State. And could be like you, could be like me, like we are in a home and someone came and invaded. They need help here. So after that, God started to use my life in this organization for like 4 years. And then I moved with them to the south of Brazil again for 1 year. And then God called me to join them. So during this time that I was working 4 years in Brazil with this organization. It was the time that God was using to talk with my dad and my mom. And this was amazing. Because God brought peace to their hearts. Because God cares about our family too. And they could see, now we understand, and they could bless me. Today they are the biggest supports that I have. When when I need help or financial help, they help me, they pray for me. They probably are watching me now. And I just praise God for my family.
Oh, there you go.
Yes, so first I just want to go back. And this was the verse that God put in my heart when I come back from YWAM and join this organization in Brazil to help the refugees. Because I was trying to understand what is justice. How can I use my profession as a lawyer to bring justice? And God just taught me justice. It's not about to fulfill the law. It's not about accomplishing what is right in a paper. But it's more than that. It's show mercy and compassion. And this goes together with Isaiah 6:12. So God was just confirming my heart. It's compassion, it's about mercy, it's about to love people, it's about to help them, not just put them in a prison and let's fulfill this law. And also God he spoke with me this very important thing. Okay, God, it's just this mercy and compassion, but for who? And like it's for the widow, the fatherless, the foreigner, and the poor. And I was thinking the refugees, they are all of that. The refugees, first of all, they are foreigners, but also they are orphans, they are fatherless, widow, and they are very poor, they are suffering. Especially the refugees that are suffering religious persecution, like people that was in Syria, Iraq, also in another countries. So Afghanistan, wherever. So we can see that.
And you had such different kinds of audiences. In Syria, these were primarily, when you were in Jordan, were they
In
refugees
Brazil.
from Syria?
My
Or from
first
Iraq.
experience, it was this in Brazil. First, it's YWAM that I told you in 2012, when we went to Chile, and I started to pray for God use my profession and missionary together. This was in Brazil. These are refugees from Syria that start to come to Brazil because they didn't have place to go. So the first experience.
And so were they predominantly Islamic or,
Most of them Christians.
oh, these are Christians?
But we had like 2 cases of Muslim background that accept Jesus. But we didn't took pictures of them. Yeah, we was trying to protect them. But these are most of them Christians
Sure, yeah.
that had to leave Syria very quickly. And we tried to not just help with documents, but bring some healing, emotional healing, and go with them in beautiful place in Brazil, especially for the kids. It was really hard, really hard. And that is, we could bring a group from United Nations for refugees and bring them to speak with the refugees in Brazil. It was nice. And God also could use my life to speak in Brazil too about the situation of refugees there, especially in the church.
Yeah, all right.
So it was God. And it was, as I told you, because God was more interested in our relationship. So I just want to highlight that. Because every time that I did that, and also today, and you know that, Randall, we need to pray a lot. Like, God, what are you doing in this situation? Because each document, it was a biggest challenge. And it was a relationship like, God, please tell me. And God, of course, He's so powerful. He could fix things very quickly.
Yeah,
But He
that's
wants
good.
us to be with Him.
So then you ended up in Jordan?
Yes, so this is Jordan. So in 2017, in June, I moved there because my organization told me we really need help there. And I was so afraid to go there. I was afraid because of it's Jordan. I was in Brazil and I just listened bad things. And it's not so like that, but in the beginning I was really afraid. So besides to relationship, I think God wants us to trust in Him. And don't be afraid of the calling of God. Like maybe you think, oh, I'll be poor if I give my money to help someone. Or don't be afraid what you lost, but keep in trust. Because God will protect you. God will give you enough for live. And also bring more than that, to bring joy. Because there is a lot of joy in serve the Lord. And of course in Jordan we had the opportunity to the ministry that I was working in Jordan, the name is Família Aziz, that means Aziz family, and they are amazing. My leader, his name was Homero, and they started this work with a Baptist church in Jordan. And the church opened the doors to provide medical help for Syrian refugees. And it was amazing because you can see usually the temples of the church is just to worship God, but suddenly the church was full of refugees seeking healing, real healing. And during this time I was helping with the kids because I'm not a doctor. But God provided amazing teams from America, so thank you very much for you. So many teams from America went there to provide medical help. And I was trying to help what I could do that time.
Now, again, what's the faith background of these people?
Muslims.
Yeah. So it's so important. One of the things that we try to encourage people is to do no harm. You know, when we're doing mission work, we need to be very careful. There were some American missionaries that went to China, and they were in a village in China, and they went door to door passing out tracts, gospel tracts, telling people how to become Christians. Well, they probably came back to their churches and they bragged about, oh, we witnessed to several thousand people. Well, what happened when they left, they arrested the local pastors in that village in China. So they did more harm. A more recent story related to Lebanon, a Muslim woman living in one of the refugee centers became a Christian. And so they put it on Facebook. Her face was seen. They gave her name and the camp where she was. And so they were Canadians who did this. And so the word came back, and all of a sudden they had this woman's name. They had to relocate the lady. They had to completely get the Christians out of that village back in Lebanon because it put all of them at risk. And so when you're working with Muslims, I mean, you weren't just hitting them with the gospel when they came in. You hit them with bandages, right? Or medicines, or dealing with them where they are. But that's why it's so important for us. When we go to India, let's ask the people in India what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. Or when we go to Burma, or when we go to these other places, because the first rule is do no harm. Don't create. So your ministry, she did ministries to Muslims, but then also when she was dealing with Iraqis, most of them were Catholics, and so she reached out to them as brothers and sisters, but also told them don't pray to Mary, right?
Yes. So this was amazing. This ministry from Aziz family, they was very careful with that. Because they was concerned, like, we want to be a blessing in the country, and we don't want the government send us out, but to see that we are really helping. And this ministry, besides providing medical help and odontological, they always provide donations for the refugees. I have the next picture here. And try to see what do you need, how we can be a blessing. So this not harm, it's a very good idea. So we also play with the children. And in Jordan, besides that, I could do my research about child marriage among the refugees. Because during this time in the Middle East, God opened the doors for me to do a master degree in Lebanon, in human rights in the Arabic world. So then the school, the university, took us to a lot of refugee camps, and we could understand better the situation. And in Lebanon and in Jordan as well, we need to really pray for the people there. The challenge that they are facing is poverty. The children are facing lack of education, and also child labor and child marriage, and a lot of sexual abuse. So you can see the conditions of the refugee camp is so hard for kids that have disabilities, and also child labor. This is in Lebanon.
There's some wonderful folks here this week from Lebanon, and what the Baptists are doing in Lebanon, I think, is some of the best work that we're doing around the world. And so from a seminary, but also like in Zali, one of these places here, just reaching out, food and clothing, and school. Some 12-year-old children never been in school in their life. Most of these refugees have lost at least one parent, maybe two. So meet some of our friends, our Baptist friends from Lebanon, while you're here this week, and hear what they're doing.
Yes, that's amazing. You can see a lot of kids, and we went as a team for students. You can see up there. I went as a student to do research about education, the problems, and it's really, they need education. And they asked, please bring a teacher inside to the refugee camp because they can't go out. And unfortunately, I was there just for a visit, but I'm really praying for them. So then came Iraq, because with the Aziz family, this ministry, I could do 3 trips to Iraq The first it was in 2017, in the end of the year, so after you, because I was not so brave. But what calls my attention, you can see this letter, is the letter N in Arabic, that means letter Nun, that means Nazarene.
Yeah.
So you can go ahead.
So yeah, they would mark the houses. We met the man when we were over there. The man it was the first house that they gave this marking to, and so that when ISIS and others would come through, they would know the ones who are Christians. They gave them three choices.
Yes.
In one night, they had 2 hours to either be killed, convert, or flee. And so they all through the Nineveh Plains, people left their homes. They'd been there for generations. They were people like us.
Yes.
They were attorneys and preachers, priests, and doctors and professors and people who owned shops. And the Christian bells in the churches rang out in Iraq from the first century all the way up until when ISIS invaded the Nineveh Plains. And they were silent for those few years, but they're back again.
Yes, we can see how the situation was totally destroyed. The country.
And Tony can fill us in. I mean, Tony works very closely with the work that's going on in Iraq and in Syria, and so be sure to learn from him what's happening there.
Yeah, so we had the opportunity to pray with the families, trying to encourage them to visit the families that was returning to the region that time. And you can see a lot of kids, and we play with them, try to bring some comfort. But what caught my attention was the history of this girl. Her name is Mariam. So when she was a child, she suffered an explosion in Iraq. And I met her in Jordan, when I was in Jordan. So when I went to Iraq, we keep in contact. She told me, I'm going back to Iraq. And I told her, oh, I'm going to Iraq. Maybe I could visit you. And she told me, well, you're most welcome. So we drive to her home. And her history is very interesting because when she was a child, she suffered an attack in a bus in Iraq. And she had her face destroyed by the bombs. But I told her, are you really willing to go back to Iraq? Because you suffered already when you was a child. We had to do a lot of surgeries to fix your face. Now you had to flat because the Islamic State, and now we're going back again. And she told me, Jesus is with me, and I can trust. And so it was amazing to meet her. And we can see the ministry from Azi's family, and Andrea knows that, and it was because of that I'm here and I met Andrea. They could rebuild the house and make a small church, our ministry that they can help the people there. And this was when after they rebuilt that place. So I just want to highlight this Nun again, because after the Nun we also visit a house that says in Arabic El Messia Mana. That means Jesus is with us. So if they wrote, no, like you are Nazarenes, we are going to persecute you. When they come back, they say, El Messiah, Jesus is with us, and we can face, we can come back, and we can do it. So this was so powerful for me. And God is always with us. So wherever God leads you, keep trusting. Don't be afraid. It could be in the beginning you feel afraid. I felt a lot of afraid, but keep praying. You can do it. So the last, it's in Asia now, where I am doing a PhD in peace building, and also helping a church there. And we could have. I'm teaching as well as a teacher assistant because of the PhD. So I'm helping teaching. And we could organize with the students from different religions backgrounds in Asia, Muslims, and all of us. We teach about the environment protection, common faith grounds for environment protection. So even if we are from different religions and beliefs, at least we can agree we need to protect the environment. So let's be together. And with that, we could share our faith as a Christians, and we could listen their beliefs as well about this. And we plant a tree together. It was an amazing experience with the students and the religious leaders. And the last, we had the opportunity to do a trip to a region that are people that are displaced, so they had to flee because the bombs, and you already told that. And this is, I'm praying, my purpose to do my research about human trafficking in this region, so please pray for that. God can do it. And I just want to close maybe with this verse, that don't be surprised if you suffer, because it's in the Bible. As a Christians, maybe you are going to pass for a situation that you don't understand. As I passed 10 years ago, and this lead me to seek God more. So don't waste your pen. Give your pen what you are facing for God and say, God, what's your purpose here with this? And be glad that, because by your suffer, you can glorify the name of Jesus. And it's not a shame, it's a privilege. So this is the Bible, and it's not what I'm... It's difficult for us to understand that, but by my suffering 10 years ago, God led me to trust more in Him. And I'm sure without suffering, I would just go to my job and don't care to seek God. And that is a wonderful joy ahead. So keep your faith strong, even when you face trials, because Jesus Christ will be revealed to the whole world through your life. And when I was in Jordan, and this happened because I had to face the secret police, and we can talk later about that. But I was praying the roof, that the place that I love to pray, and then I saw this flower, the first picture. And from where this flower is coming, I was very surprised. And then I started to see, and I opened, and I saw the roots. And you can see there is no place, no way that this flower could flourish in this so hard situation. But God spoke with me, like, even if you face a situation that you don't see, it's impossible for a flower flourish without the soil. I can do it. And God is so powerful. God can do anything. Just keep trusting, have faith, because He can make you flourish even if in the hard times. And you see, it's impossible. God can do it. So yeah, keep doing what's right. Trust your lives to the God who created you, for He will never fail.
Don't leave that. Like I said, the Bible oftentimes didn't make sense to me. Like the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, it didn't seem like the poor ought to be blessed. It seems like the rich ought to be blessed. But the Bible makes sense to people who are facing persecution, because the Bible was written by persecuted people for persecuted people. And so one of the things that we've been able to do is to see the Bible through their eyes. And Gaetano has been in prison. He's been beaten, hung by his feet, oil poured over him. He's had all kinds of experiences of persecution. And the Bible makes sense to Gaetano in ways that I would never be able to understand because of God's presence that are there. In just a moment, we're going to have a break, and I want you to hear each other's stories. Don't just hang out with the people you already know, but hear each other's stories, and let's learn from each other. Now, like I said, you got your law degree, you're working on a PhD, and you're hoping that'll make you rich and famous, right? Yeah. You need an agent. This isn't working. Yeah.
I just want to be close to God, really, every day in my life. It's like David when he prayed, God, I want to be in your house forever. And I really just want to listen God's voice. And to be honest, it wasn't the hardest time that I could see His voice so loudly. So sometimes I'm afraid to suffer or face something difficult, but I'm sure that God will be there, and He will speak very loudly to me, and this encouraging me to sometimes don't be afraid. Sometimes.
Isn't it interesting to see how God was working in her life all the way, even when she was a child, and being in church for their parents, and then praying for missionaries? God was working in your life. In Wilberforce's life, when he was like 11 or 12, he was living with his aunt and uncle, He met people like John Newton and others who became very influential, even though it didn't take root then. Later it would happen. And so when God was working in your life to lead you into the law profession,
Yes.
and then yet he opened your eyes through YWAM.
Yes.
So how would you clarify your passion? What is your passion for life right now? It continues to change, right? I mean, God just brings you from one opportunity to the other. Were these your dreams when you were in law school, that you'd get to do these things?
No, for sure, my dreams, I always choose, it was to work with the government. We call Ministério Público in Brazil. I don't know how to translate. But we don't know how. Yeah, it's an organization that helps they bring justice. It's not lawyers, not judge, but they observe the justice. It's like that. So my dream was that.
Yeah.
But to be rich.
Yeah.
But God had another dreams, and God really opened my eyes when He told me, if you want to really seek the justice, if you want to bring justice like you, this is your dream. It's not about money, reputation. It's about mercy and compassion. And people that need are people that are poor, fatherless, widow, foreigners, refugees, people that suffer persecution. They need justice.
We're so appreciative to have Lacy not only speaking, but one of our Timothy Fellows. Let's show her how much we appreciate her leadership. God bless you. We are so anxious to hear Dr. George. And again, I mentioned that he was the dean, the founding dean of Beeson Divinity School, prolific writer, one of our most gifted historians. Another thing he's done is work very closely with evangelicals and Catholics in dialogue. We actually had a mutual friend, Chuck Colson. Chuck Colson was notorious for his involvement with President Nixon when they went through the indictment. He was an attorney, and I thought he became a Christian just to get out of jail. And so I really didn't have any respect for him. But then I got to become his pastor for a while and got to know him well. And they were so concerned about evangelicals and Catholics together. I mean, all the way up to the Pope, and to the local churches and leaders. I was stunned that so many evangelicals resented that. They didn't want to have conversations with papists, And I thought, why wouldn't we want those conversations? Why don't we want to hear their stories? And yet Timothy never compromised his conservative theological perspectives, and yet was so gracious in conversations about theological issues. So we're honored to have him here. And Timothy, if you'll come at this time, we welcome you. Bless you.
Thank you so much, Randall. And I'm just delighted to be here at Wilberforce 21. I've known about this work since it began and been kind of a part of it from the beginning. It's one of the works of the Holy Spirit in our day, I think. And especially now, I like this connecting with so many younger leaders from around the world, and the Timothy program is just great. What a wonderful testimony we heard from Lais. Did I get that right?
Yes.
From Lais in Brazil. That was just fantastic. And I'm so glad to connect with some friends other than Randall and Sheila, whom I've known forever, I think. But also Tony Peck is here somewhere. His work with the EBF has just been great over the years. And my friend Jack Hunter is here. He's the director of missions for the New Orleans Baptist Association, and who's traveled with me to many exotic places in the Lord's world. So it's great we could be here together. And all of you, I look forward to meeting. I've met several of you, and I look forward to some good conversation. Now, Randall asked me to do the impossible, so I'll attempt it, to talk about Baptist and religious liberty. So how do you do that? Well, I want to begin by making a point about religious freedom that it is, there's a book actually called The Travail of Religious Freedom. It was written by Roland Bainton, who's most famous for his biography of Martin Luther, Here I Stand. That was published in 1950, the year I was born. The following year, he published a book called The Travail of Religious Liberty. And he makes the point that it is a very long and arduous journey, religious freedom. It's not something that happened just once or twice or even in spurts. But it's a pilgrimage through history with ups and downs, with setbacks, drawbacks, as well as some victories along the way. So I want to emphasize that to start with, because as a word of encouragement, because there are times in the history of God's people when there's been lots of reasons to be very discouraged about religious freedom, just because there wasn't very much, if any. And yet we see that over time, God works in all kinds of different ways to bring about a different result. And we're a part of that. We're here today because others were so faithful to this particular cause when it was very difficult to do so. My first visit to Oxford, I don't remember the year. I was a graduate student at Harvard University. I was doing research looking for a dissertation topic for my PhD. So I went to Oxford primarily to consult with Dr. Barry White. He was then the principal of Regent's Park College, Baptist College in Oxford, a great historian. And I knew I wanted to work in the Reformation, and Barry White was an expert in the English Reformation, especially separatism, the early Baptist movement. And he gave me some good guidance, became kind of a mentor to me at that stage of my work, and directed me, said, you need to go over to the Bodleian. Well, I'd never been to the Bodleian. I had heard of it, of course. It had been around for a while. And he said, there's a book there you need to get from the shelves. It is The Mystery of Iniquity by Thomas Helwys. Now, I'd read that book, but he said, you need to go and actually look at it. And so I went. In those days, when you wanted to get a book from the Bodleian, you had to put in your request the day or two before and come back at a certain time and see if it had been retrieved. That's what I did. I think I waited at least a full day. And the next day, they brought out to me the package and opened it very carefully. I think I had to use gloves to handle it. And there was a copy of a little pamphlet, really, it's a little small book called The Mystery of Iniquity by Thomas Helwys. And the reason Barry White wanted me to actually look at that copy and not just read the words that had been reprinted somewhere was because on the flyleaf of that book there are some handwritten words by Thomas Helwys that give the purpose of what he was doing in writing that book. It says this: Hear, O king, and despise not the counsel of the poor, and let their complaints come before thee. The king is a mortal man and not God, and therefore hath no power over the immortal souls of his subjects to make laws and ordinances for them, and to set spiritual lords above them. O king, be not deceived and seduced to sin against God, whom you ought to obey, not against your poor servants, who ought and will to obey you in all things, in body, life, and goods, or else let their lives be taken from the earth. God save the king. And then in large letters, handwritten, Thomas, T-H-O, he abbreviated it, Helwys. And then the place where it was written or published was listed, Spitalfields. Spitalfields was still there. It's still on the earth, but it isn't called Spitalfields much anymore. It's called Spittal because of the hospital that was there in medieval times. It was just outside the gates of London, and here many of the early Baptists and others who were coming into London would gather. This is where Thomas Helwys wrote or signed this copy of A Mystery of Iniquity. In the book itself, there's this statement, very famous statement. Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever. It does not pertain to the earthly power to punish them in the least. This is the first time in the English language there was a universal appeal for religious freedom. Now, there's some things you could say that were forerunners to this, but the first time it's so openly, blatantly said is by Thomas Helwys. Now, look at the categories he lists there. Let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever. Heretics. The ancient Code of Justinian had been revived in the 16th century. This was the basis of Roman law in the late Roman Empire and became for medieval ages the same. It was revived in the 16th century, and it called for capital punishment for two offenses. One of them was denying the doctrine of the Trinity, anti-Trinitarianism. The other was refusing to baptize infants. Both were regarded as heresies. Later, Michael Servetus will be burned alive at the stake in Geneva because he was both an anti-Trinitarian and an Anabaptist, practicing rebaptism. This was heretical. And Thomas Helwys is saying, whoever they are, let them be heretics. Now, this was the year 1612 when he wrote those words and published that book. 1 year after the King James Version of the Bible was published, 1611. And in the year 1612, there were two heretics, let us call them, Bartholomew Leggett and Edward Winslow were their names, who were burned alive at the stake, put to death, not very far from Spitalfields, where Thomas Helwys published this book. So this was current events. This was happening in his own time. This is also the same region, same section of London where a young guy named Roger Williams was born and growing up. And it's at least possible, maybe even likely, that Williams personally witnessed the execution of these heretics, Leggett and Winslow. So let them be heretics. Let them be Turks. Now, why does he bring the Turks in? Well, the Turks were the Muslims, of course. And in 1453, the great metropolitan center of the East, Constantinople, we call Istanbul today, had fallen to the armies of the Ottoman Turks. And all during the 16th century, there were incursions from the Turkish armies into Europe. By the time Helwys is on the scene in the early 17th century, the Turks have established themselves as a great trading power with Europe. Surely where coffee was introduced into Europe, coffee houses were imported into London from Turkey. And so people knew about Turks. They could see them in some of the bazaars and markets of London. But there was no allowance for their belief system, no allowance for their worship pattern. Helwys reaches out and embraces the Turks as well as the heretics. And Jews. There had been Jews in England since the time of the Norman invasion, but as in much else of Europe over the centuries, persecution against the Jews had increased. And in 1290, they were expelled from England. So there were very few, if any, Jews living in England when Helwys wrote these words. Later, in some measure, I think, as a result of this coming to awareness of religious freedom, there was an effort under Oliver Cromwell to open the doors of England back to the Jews and invite them to return, and many of them did. And there's been a thriving community of Jewish people in what is now Great Britain since that time. But Helwys had the wisdom, the foresight, the insight. What was it? To reach out and include not only heretics and Turks and Jews, but then in case he's forgotten somebody, or whatsoever. Whatsoever covers a wide swath. There are the Catholics, of course. And there are the people that were just known often as atheists. There was a small group of people called the Family of Love. It's hard to know kind of what they were about, but they were on the very margins of society and not accepted by anybody. But Helwys is willing to open up the gates to the heretics, to the Turks, to the Jews, to the whatsoever people, and say it does not pertain to the earthly power to punish them in the least. Helwys advocated for what John Knox called, this becomes a Baptist phrase too, the crown rights of the Redeemer. His argument is explicitly Christological, that Jesus Christ is king over every human conscience. And Jesus Christ does not rule by compulsion. He persuades. He does not compel. He woos and wins. That's his style. That's his method. That's his approach. And it's in allegiance to Jesus Christ and the crown rights of the Redeemer that Helwys is compelled to open the gates wide to everybody. Now, it's addressed to the king. The king is James I, King James Version king. And we have no idea whether King James ever saw or read this book. Most likely he did not. First of all, because it wasn't an officially published book. It was almost a homemade underground printing press. And so when you look at the book today, the one I held in my hands in Bodleian Library, it's not a very attractively published book. The letters are smeared, they're not even, the words are, the spelling was not even standardized in that period, so they're all over the place. This is something that was published. There are only 2 copies left in the world. One is the one I saw. There's one other. And what was really offensive about this was not just what he said. I mean, what he said is bad enough. Let everybody, whosoever, whatsoever, receive freedom. But what was really offensive is not that he thought this or that he said this, but that he published this. That he put it in print. And this was a grave offense, not only against the king, but against the entire system of church-state relations that obtained in the English realm at that time. Now, Helwys was brought up in Nottinghamshire, a northern county in England. He was not of the royalty, but he was of what's called the minor gentry. And his family was somewhat well-to-do, enough to send him to London to study law at Gray's Inn, which he did. So he was a person of some means, of some substance in those days. But like many people before him, especially those that were being drawn more and more to question things in religion, he had been, first of all, an Anglican, baptized as a child, as an infant. He had become a Puritan, critical of the Church of England, but seeking reform from within the Church of England. After that, a separatist. Came a breaking point where he could no longer stay within the Church of England, came to regard it as a false church with a false ministry and a false baptism. So he left the Church of England, became a separatist. And then later a Baptist. Now that happened in Amsterdam, when he and other separatists, particularly John Smith, had fled England, fled persecution under King James, and resettled in Amsterdam, which had a friendlier, not completely open religious freedom, but a friendlier toleration of religious diversity. He went to Amsterdam. They became a part of this congregation. And on a January day in 1609, in the bakehouse of John Munter, Smith takes a basin of water and pours it over his own head in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, rebaptizing himself or self-baptizing himself. And then he does the same thing to Helwys and the small circle that was in that group. This was a radical act. Somebody said to Smith, "Why have you done this? Not even Jesus baptized himself. He went to John the Baptist for it. And here you take it upon yourself, arrogate this to you." In time, Helwys picks up on that argument and comes to agree with it and says we were wrong to rebaptize ourselves and reconstitute the church in that way. And Smith himself eventually seeks membership in the Waterlander Mennonite congregation, which already practiced a form of believers' baptism. But Helwys rejects that whole pattern and decides that we need to go back and start all over from scratch again. And he becomes convinced of something else. He had fled persecution in England, went to Amsterdam, but now he and a very few of his associates become convinced that too had been wrong, to leave England under persecution. So they hire a small vessel to recross the English Channel and go back to England again. And that's the origin of what we call the First Baptist Church on English soil, the one at Spitalfields that Thomas Helwys was a part of. Now, they rejected, it's important to say, one of the things they had against John Smith is that he had become more and more drawn toward the radical apoliticism, let's call it, of John Smith and the Anabaptist movement. That's why Smith sought union with the Waterlander Mennonites. But Helwys said, no, we don't need to do that. We don't need to go that far. We don't have to renounce the government or say a magistrate can't even be a Christian, can't belong to the church. So we're willing to recognize that the government, the king in England, is ordained by God, Romans 13. And that we owe obedience to the king, and we will obey the king in all lawful things the king asks us to do. We are not pacifists. Now, the Anabaptists, many of them were pacifists. And John Smith became very close to being a pacifist. But Helwys says, we will fight in the army. We will bear arms. We will serve in the police force. But what we will not do is to compromise our conscience. We will not allow the king to dictate the kind of worship we ought to do, the kind of belief we ought to have. Now, I'm emphasizing this primarily to show how the Baptist view of religious freedom was born out of persecution, suffering, martyrdom. Thomas Helwys was clapped up in Newgate prison and died several years later. We think 1615, 1616, we're not sure the exact day. But leaving behind his wife, her name was Joan, and they had 7 children. So at the very beginning of the Baptist movement is this willingness to suffer for your convictions, all the way faithful unto death if necessary. Now, Helwys was not alone. There weren't many. That was a very small church that was planted in Spitalfields. And it was a while before there were others. There were eventually others. But Thomas Helwys leads the way in paving the path for religious freedom among Baptists in England. He deserves to be better known than he is. Some of us Baptists have kind of discovered that, and so there's a lot more about Helwis available now than there was when I started studying this years ago, I still think he deserves a lot more attention than he's received for several reasons. I say he was not alone. There were two others who began to also publish on religious freedom about this time in England. We know their names. One of them was a man named Leonard Busher. We don't know much about him. Somehow he was one of the few that escaped martyrdom. As far as we know, he was not martyred. He kind of fades into history. We do get a glimpse of him. He goes back to Holland, the city of Delft, in the year 1641. He's 71 years old. And his one work is called Religion's Peace that he wrote, that really is a classic statement of religious freedom. We remember Leonard Busher not only because of his strong stand for religious liberty, but also because he gives us a witness that some Baptists were practicing baptism by immersion long before it became the standard practice among Baptists in the late 1630s, 1640s. He refers in one of his letters to baptism as being dipped for dead in the water. It sure suggests a baptism by immersion. Another person we know a little bit more about is John Merton. John Merton succeeded Thomas Helwis as the pastor of that little congregation, that Baptist congregation in Spitalfields, but comes against the same system of oppression that Helwis had suffered from, is imprisoned, and in fact dies in prison 10 years later. Having written several works, the most important, I think, the most significant, a most humble supplication. It was addressed to the same king, James I, published in 1620. And it was written in milk on sheets of paper, which were used to stop stopples for the bottles of milk. And it was a form of writing that remained invisible until it was held up to a flame, and then you could see through it. Somehow, young Roger Williams got a copy of this and refers to it, quotes from it, in his own writings on religious freedom. This is from John Merton. Now, if you take Helwis's writings, The Mystery of Iniquity, and a few other smaller treatises he wrote, if you take Leonard Busher's Religion's Peace, and you take John Merton's Humble Supplication, and a few other writings, you can construct an early Baptist doctrine of religious freedom. And I want to point out 7 factors that are in these treatises. They're not all of equal weight, let me say. And they come at it from different angles. And that might be a point worth emphasizing. Religious freedom is often argued from a strictly religious or strictly secular angle today. But in fact, in history, I think it was a mixture of those and others as well. So let me just go through these 7 real quickly, and then I'll have some closing comments because we want to have some discussion about this. I've already mentioned the focus on the lordship of Jesus Christ, the crown rights of the Redeemer. Baptists have always been, we say, people of the book. We've always had great respect and love and commitment to the Holy Scriptures as the Word of God. And so certainly did Helwis and these early Baptists. So they were driven back to the New Testament, to the Scriptures, confessing that God alone is the Lord of the conscience. So this particular doctrine of religious freedom is grounded in a distinctive understanding of who God is, the character of God, that God alone is the Lord of the conscience. That becomes almost a phrase that's repeated in a number of different documents. And that therefore there should be immunity from religious coercion. This is the cornerstone of the teaching of an unconstrained conscience before God. It's rooted in the character of who God is and who Jesus Christ came to be and to reveal God to us as. One of the early Christian writings, which is not so well known as it ought to be, it's a little letter called the Epistle to Diognetus. That was an apology that the Christians wrote in the time of the Roman persecutions. It asked a question. Did God send Christ, as some suppose, as a tyrant brandishing fear and terror? Not so, but in gentleness and meekness. For compulsion is no attribute of God. It's an amazing phrase from the 2nd century. Compulsion is no attribute of God. And so these early Baptists taught that the right to religious freedom had its foundations in the character of God and the example of Christ himself. And one of the verses they appealed to again and again was Matthew 21:22. Jesus' famous statement, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and unto God the things that are God's. Now that's a wonderful statement. I mean, everything Jesus says is okay, right? It's a wonderful statement. But it's also a statement that lends itself to being misunderstood in various ways. If you just took it out of context, lifted it out of its biblical setting, and made it into a universal principle, you could read it as saying that there are two equally important and powerful forces, Caesar and God. Render to Caesar what's Caesar's, to God what's God's, as though these were two forces locked in competition in the cosmos. Of course, that's not what Jesus meant. It's not what the Bible teaches. But Jesus is teaching two things here. Duality, but not dualism. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Everything belongs to God. It's His. You know, when the Quakers were expelled from Boston in the early 17th century, and they were told to go away, we don't want you here. You can go down to Rhode Island, they have some freedom there. Go down to Pennsylvania where other Quakers are. But one of the Quaker preachers was named Mary Dyer. She insisted she would not leave because, and she quoted this, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. This is God's world. And so she returned, 3 times expelled. She returned to Boston Common and was hanged to death in 1660. And you visit Boston Common today, you'll see a plaque recognizing the death of Mary Dyer, one of the early martyrs for religious freedom in America. She's a Quaker woman. And yet there is a radically important distinction to be made between the things that belong to God and the things that belong to Caesar. So the two kingdoms is sometimes called. And Baptists have always emphasized this distinction. Now we can argue, and we may argue among ourselves, a lot of Baptists argue among ourselves, as to how radical that distinction ought to be. I mean, total separation so that there's no vestige of religious import in the public square at all, or a kind of separation that allows for, with freedom of conscience, some presence of religious thinking. I mean, those issues are being debated even now in the United States Supreme Court. They haven't been settled. And so they're within the Baptist family, and certainly within the Christian and even the evangelical family, there are varying views on this question. But we all recognize that the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of God is distinct in some very important and uncompromisable ways from the kingdoms of this world. And therefore we will not give to Caesar that which belongs to God. This is already present in these early English Baptist writings. And it shows up in the fact that these Baptists allowed the possibility of a Christian magistrate. The Anabaptists wouldn't. That's outside the perfection of Christ. You can have kings and princes and lords, but the Baptists, the English Baptists, said, we will allow magistrates to be members of our churches, to bear the arms. But what they would not allow is a doctrine of Christian magistracy. You could have a Christian magistrate, but not Christian magistracy. And this is a point that Roger Williams makes powerfully in arguing in Rhode Island for what we call the separation of church and state. He says the king, the Lord, has authority to enforce the second table of the law, but not the first. The first table of the law has to do with worshiping God. It has to do with having God alone as the Lord. The second table of the law has to do with murder and the kinds of thievery, stealing, the kinds of things that have to do more with our social relationship with one another. That was Roger Williams' way of resolving that difficult issue. The two kingdoms. A Christian magistrate? Possible. Even desirable. Christian magistracy? No. So we get into this discussion, we talk about, do we have a Christian nation? Do we want a Christian nation? What would that look like? What does that mean? The Baptists say we put the brakes on here because of the dangers to which it has led and can lead. Now, point number 2, I'm going to give you 7 if you're counting. This is point number 2, the inviolability of the conscience. In addition to the lordship of Christ, which is the primary theological point that these Baptists are making, close behind it, though, is the inviolability of the individual conscience before God. And key here was the idea that every human being, whoever that person is or may be, every single one, is made in the image of God, the Imago Dei. And this means 3 things, at least. Every person has moral agency. And every person is able to discern by reason some things that God requires. One of the famous phrases that came out of the same period, it's not a Baptist phrase, but I think it fits the Baptist idea of the Imago Dei, is the light of reason is the candle of the Lord. We don't want to depend on reason as an authority because it has grave limitations in the things of God. And yet we are not, as they said, sticks and stones. We are not brutes. We are made in the image of God, and we have not only moral agency and reason, but also conscience. The importance, the inviolability of conscience. Now, it's true that a conscience doesn't give us absolute complete assurance that what our conscience is saying is right, because the conscience must be rightly informed. The conscience must be taught. The conscience must be trained to virtue. And yet God has placed this mark of His image within every single human being. Every single human being. So you ask the question, did Hitler have a conscience? Well, insofar as he was a human being, he must have had a conscience. But it was not one informed by the things of God. It was like the New Testament describes a conscience that is seared with a hot iron, given over to a reprobate mind is another way the New Testament talks about this kind of ill-formed conscience that leads to the atrocities of tyranny. But let's not forget that the conscience itself is a gift from God. It's to be cultivated, it's to be trained, and there is about every human being in the world, whoever it is, what we might call an ontological nobility. An innate desire to live our lives with moral agency, with freedom, with authenticity, with sincerity. Where does that come from? This is a gift of God. And that is why Baptists have so often resisted the idea of toleration of religion. One of the great speeches on religious freedom in the modern period was by a Baptist pastor, George W. Truett, very famous speech he gave in Washington, D.C. on the steps of the U.S. Capitol in the year 1920. And he doesn't invent this point, but he makes it very profoundly that religious freedom is not just toleration of religion. Because if you have the right to tolerate a religion, you have the right to non-tolerate it, to persecute it. But this is something that comes to us from God directly. The inviolability of the conscience. And that leads to my third point, the non-coercive character of faith. This becomes a part of the Baptist arsenal of arguments. Again and again and again, you read this. You cannot coerce faith. You cannot make anybody believe. Now, maybe you can make them say they believe. You might make them act like they believe to a certain extent. But faith itself is something that cannot be produced by coercion. And when you try to do that, you end up with a totally counterproductive program. What you can do by trying to coerce faith, you can turn people into hypocrites. But this is not what Jesus Christ calls us to make. He wants us to make disciples, not hypocrites. And the Baptists here make a polemical point about baptism. Why they don't baptize babies. In that famous speech by George W. Truett I mentioned from 1920, he uses the word unthinkable. Well, I can think of infant baptism. I've seen it done. But George Truett said it's unthinkable because God does not take pleasure in any form of what he calls sponsorial religion. Religion sponsored by somebody else, on behalf of somebody else. So believers' baptism presupposes repentance, faith, and regeneration. And there are some places in the world, even today, I think of places in Eastern Europe and other places, where we speak of believers' baptism so easily and glibly almost, they prefer the term repenters' baptism because it indicates a turning of your life one direction to the other and the non-coercive character of faith. Now let me quickly mention these others. I don't have time to give any exposition of them really, but I think they're all flowing from the principles I've already mentioned. For evangelism. That we go into the highways and byways and tell people the story of Jesus Christ and invite them to come in. And so the famous verse in Revelation 3:20 where Jesus stands at the door, knocks, if anyone will open the door, I will come in. We will have dinner together. That's the image that these Baptists use. Evangelism. Next would be, 5 would be Christian unity. Now there's something paradoxical here because these Baptists were very sectarian in a certain sense. A small group over against the governing society, over against the governing power and the environing society. And yet there was here somehow a glimpse of a greater understanding of Christian unity. It will not come into fruition until much later. But you find religious freedom is one of the things, maybe one of the few things that bring together Baptists are so very different in the 17th century. Helwys belonged to the General Baptist, more Arminian in his theology and soteriology. Roger Williams was a Calvinist in his theology, and later particular Baptists certainly were. But on this one issue of religious freedom, they found an ability to agree and to come together. And I wonder today, is it still possible for Baptists, with all of our divisions and differences, to find a common meeting ground in a renewed commitment to religious freedom? I think it would be a wonderful thing if that could happen. Okay, my two last ones I want to mention, these 7 principles, have to do with politics and economics. Politics, the Baptists had the idea that if you could just have religious freedom for everybody, not just for us, but for all, that would give no reason for there to be treason and plots against the king, like the gunpowder plot that had just happened in England. But that we would find a common ground. You might say that's idealistic, that's unrealistic, and that may be true, but here's a goal, here's an ideal worth living for and giving your life for. And in Baptist parlance, this becomes known as the goal or the ideal of a free church within a free state. It's again one of Truett's famous lines from that sermon in 1920. And then economics. That we care for all people and care especially for the poor, the needy. Religious freedom is a way to sponsor and advance that. And one of the lines in these early Baptists have to do with this very point. Then shall not the poor, the lame, the sick, the weak ones be stocked and whipped. Neither shall the poor, the stranger, the fatherless, the widows be driven to beg from place to place. Then shall not the great defraud and wrong the small, the rich oppress the poor by usury and little wages. Then shall not servants be forced from marriage by bonds. He's looking for a time when there will be peace and everyone under their own vine, lauding and praising God, honoring and obeying the King. It's rooted and related to the concept of religious freedom. Now, a few years ago, I was invited, actually appointed by our former General Secretary of the BWA, Neville Callum, to speak at the Synod for the New Evangelization held at the Vatican. They invite what they call fraternal delegates from different denominations, part of the more ecumenical openness since Vatican II. And I made the main point of my talk, religious freedom. And I said this: throughout our history, Baptists have been ardent champions of religious freedom, not only for ourselves, but for all persons everywhere. In recent times, religious freedom has become a part of public moral discourse. And I quoted here the 18th article of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. But before religious freedom is a right, I say, it is a gift rooted in the character of God himself and in the kind of relationship to which he calls all persons. And the Roman Catholics have their own declaration on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, which comes from Vatican II, which says this: although at times in the life of the people of God, the Church has pursued its pilgrimage through twists and turns of history, there have been ways of acting hardly in tune with the spirit of the gospel, for which we need to repent. Nevertheless, the Church is teaching that no one's faith should be coerced. The non-coercive character of faith is firm. And I say, and I think this has special relevance to the mission of Wilberforce 21, today in many places, religious freedom is under assault in many ways. Sometimes blatant, easily recognizable, other times more subtle and maybe more sinister because of that. All Christians who take seriously Jesus' call to evangelize must also stand and work together for the protection and flourishing of universal religious freedom, both for individuals and for institutions of faith. So religious freedom is not just a personal, private thing that we can rejoice in. It also has to do with our witness in the public square, with our witness and our mission to serve Jesus Christ in the world. I think I'm going to stop here in case we, Randall, have some interested questions or comments. I'd love to hear from you.
Stay here, Timothy. Really appreciate these comments. And I think that one of the distinctives of Baptists has been religious freedom. And yet I think we have been very shallow in our understanding of the theological reasons for religious freedom. And so many people who call themselves religious freedom advocates are very exclusive in their understanding of religious freedom. I mean, actually, they want freedom for me, but they don't want freedom for anyone else. And so these theological principles, I don't think we're teaching them why we do believe in religious freedom. And so this is extremely helpful for us to know the history, know the cost that was involved, whether it was Helwis or others that paid a price for this so that we'd have it today. And it's not just a political issue. We need to know theologically why we believe this. So comment or question? Yeah, Tony?
Timothy, thank you so much. I really appreciated this exposition, particularly you pausing on all the categories of Helwis, which we so easily just read.
Yes.
So my first question is, can we get a copy of the paper?
Yes, when there is one.
Okay, thank you. That would be great. And then two comments. One is a smaller comment, one's on a bigger issue. The smaller one would be, under evangelism, you mentioned this text, go out into the highways and byways, but wasn't that a problematic text because it actually says compel them to come in. As I understand it, going back to Augustine, that was used as a coercive text for...
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Augustine interpreted that against the Donatists in particular, compelle intrare, by force, and so he called on the Roman forces to do that. But I think later in the tradition, that use of compel is demythologized, let's say. It's questions. And so I guess the question is, can you have compulsion without coercion? Can you compel people by persuasion as well as by force? That would be the more Baptist way.
You like urge them?
Do it with, yes.
We can reinterpret it, yeah. And the more general question is one that's intrigued me for many years. Where did Helwis get this from? Because in a book that's a polemic against so many people, there's this little gem that sits in the middle of it. You and I both sat at the feet of Barry White, who took the view, as you know, that generally English Baptists came from separatism. But I can't help thinking in the kind of formulaic way in which Helwis expresses it, it is so similar to similar Anabaptist expressions of religious freedom that predate Helwys. Do you think he was perhaps influenced, maybe in Amsterdam, on this issue more by Anabaptists than by separatists?
I would like to think so. I don't know of any evidence that points in that connection. You know, what I think was happening in the Reformation is it's like popcorn. The fire gets hot and it's just pop, 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 pop. And they look the same, they sound the same. So many of the things the Anabaptists taught and believed, the Baptists pick up on. Another is believer's baptism, of course. Or another one's the concept of a covenant, a covenanted community. That's an Anabaptist concept. And so you find these recurring again in a different way in the Baptist movement. I don't see direct influence. Some scholars have tried to argue it. But I do think the atmosphere was such that you give a spark and soon you have a conflagration.
All right, thanks. Robbie, did you have a question?
Yeah. Religious freedom, I mean, if you give religious freedom to Muslims, their freedom, allows them to conduct jihad. Anyone who is against Allah, they want to exterminate that person. So how do you interpret giving religious freedom in the context of Muslims wanting to have freedom?
I wrote a book a few years ago called Is the Father of Jesus the God of Muhammad? Because I think there are some clear distinctions theologically between Christianity and Islam, as well as historically. However, I have come to believe, based on my acquaintance mainly with Muslims who don't accept, you might say, a traditionalist hardline view of jihad, but who seek kind of a sense of consensus and lack of coercion in their understanding of it. I know Tony's had a lot more experience in this field than I have, but I would just question whether that one characterization is valid across all of Islam. There are Muslims involved in dialogue with Christians and others who are seeking a different, let's say, more peaceful path than the traditionalist view of jihad. Though I have no doubt that you would find a number in that tradition as well.
There's another Baptist distinctive that I understand, and that is don't get in the way of Baptists at lunchtime. So we're going to exercise that coming up. But first, let's let Timothy know how much we appreciate this incredible. We want to continue these conversations, and I will say, Robbie, the new ambassador for international religious freedom in the U.S., Ambassador Hussein, John and Trent would know this better than I, is Muslim, and he's been very strong on religious freedom for people of all faiths and people of no faith. And so one of the things that we're excited about, 21 River Force, is that when he speaks to the Fulani militants in Nigeria, then he speaks as a Muslim, saying it ought to be religious freedom for people of all faiths. And so as a Muslim, he may be heard in a way where we felt like we weren't being heard as Christians. You're talking about the Middle Belt and up in northern Nigeria. But so we're very encouraged by him. Majid is a Muslim from Northern Virginia. He was just appointed to the USCIRF, United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. He and Bob Roberts, who will be here at this conference, the BWA conference this week, and speaking in one of the Religious Freedom Commission meetings, he's in dialogue all over the world, really, on David Saperstein, who's a Jewish rabbi. The three of them go and talk about religious freedom for people of all faiths. And so there are Muslim key leaders who also believe that religious freedom for people of all faiths is great. So that's a question we're really concerned with, because we see so much persecution in northern Nigeria or in many places in the Middle East. But we have to watch out for nationalism anywhere. Like in India, you've got many who want Hindu nationalism. In Myanmar, you have those who want Buddhism. And to be honest, there are many Christians who want Christian nationalism. They want it to be free just for us. And so, Robbie, thank you for that. That's something that we deal with constantly. How do you create an environment where there is respect? And I'm glad you mentioned what George said about tolerance. Tolerance is not the answer. It's not about tolerance. It's about freedom. I think too we've got the best message. When there's religious freedom, nobody has the story of Jesus, and so I just love being in an environment where we're able to discuss freely our beliefs, because no one, can compare it to the story that we have. So we'll continue these conversations, and right after lunch, we're going to talk about the principles of competence. What are the 5 best practices? Today we've heard about passion from Liza and studying about that. We'll hear about these 5 principles. We're going to go through them very, very quickly. We're going to get to hear about the strategic approach to transformational leadership when we hear the story of Martin Luther King Jr. from Warren and Warren's experience, not just limited to that, but talking about the strategic, how do we change unjust laws, how do we change narratives, those kinds of things. So we've got a real packed few hours. Lunch is served in the Sanford Camp cafeteria. You can look out the window out here, and you can see a couple of buildings behind us. There's a walkway that goes between those 2 buildings. You go through that walkway back to the right, and I think the cafeteria is right there. So it's just about a 5-minute walk. We're going to try our best to start back at 1. I know that's really cramped for time. We're going to try our best so that we can be through by 4 o'clock. But thank you guys. You've been great sports, and thank you, Timothy, for outstanding lessons.